students. This is the third video on the base of the skull, the internal base of the skull. That means the norma basalis interna, okay? The internal aspect of the base of the skull. In the first two videos, we learn about the anterior part of the base of the skull. In the second, we learn the middle part, and in the third we will learn here the posterior part of the base of the skull. Okay, now the base of the skull in the posterior part, or the posterior most part here, is the deepest part. Okay, it is quite deep, okay, in comparison to the anterior part, which is at a higher level than the middle part, which is at a lower level, and the posterior part is at the lowest level or the deepest level. Now this part lodges the hindbrain. Hindbrain means it lodges the cerebellum, the pons, and medulla oblongata. So the complete hindbrain lies within this posterior part of the base of the skull. Now, let us come to the base of the skull proper and see which are the bones which forms the posterior part. The posterior part is formed by, in midline, by the body of the sphenoid. We have seen that in the middle part, the central part is formed by the body of the sphenoid, where the sella turcica is located, and here is the posterior part where the body of the sphenoid is there, okay, body of the, and still lower down it is formed by the occipital bone. So there are two parts which forms the median part of the posterior fossa. Above it is the body of the sphenoid, and below it is the occipital bone. Okay, now this posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. This is the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. It is the third bone which forms the posterior part. Okay, bones which form the posterior parts. Then there is the posterior surface. After the petrous temporal bone, there is the mastoid part of the temporal bone, which also form the part of the posterior fossa. Posterior fossa here. Now, this, if you see it from outside, this is the mastoid part, okay? And this is the perithomastoid suture. This suture here, it is the perithomastoid suture, and this is the lambdoid suture, which down below is continuous as the occipitomastoid suture. So this is perithomastoid and occipital, and this part is the mastoid part of the bone, temporal bone, and same is here. So in the angle here, lateral angle, it is the mastoid part of the temporal bone which forms the bone of the posterior fossa, and then there is the posterior angle of the parietal bone. See, this is the parietal bone if you see it from outside, and this is that posterior angle of the parietal bone just above the mastoid bone. So this part will be formed by the posterior angle of the parietal bone. So many bones, they take part in formation. In this skull, the sutures are not very clear, so I am not able to show you which part is the mastoid and which part is the inferior angle of the parietal. But I will review once again which are the bones. It is the part of the posterior most part of the body of the sphenoid. Then it is the occipital bone. A large area is formed by the occipital bone. Then the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, mastoid part of the temporal bone, and the posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone. Many bones, okay, the large part of it is formed by this occipital bone, which is quite extensive bone, okay, and it has three parts. Though anterior to the foramina magnum, it is the basilar part. On the side of foramina magnum, it is the condylar part, because from outside these are the occipital condyles, and posteriorly it is the squamous part. So a large part of this fossa is formed by the occipital bone. Let us come to the sutures and fissure of posterior cranial fossa. The lower end of the lambdoid suture, okay? We'll see the lower end of the lambdoid suture which is present here, okay? It is not shown in this, but there will be the suture, that is, this is the lambdoid suture. See here, this suture. This was on external surface, this is the lambdoid suture, and this will be where the junction of asterion is there. This is the lower end of the lambdoid suture, can be seen here. You can see here this suture, okay, a very faint, not very prominent, but this suture is seen here. This is that junction point of, this is the lowermost end of the lambdoid suture. If you can just focus, I mean to say enlarge, you can see this is the lambdoid suture as seen from inside. Okay, so this is the lower end of the lambdoid suture. Then there is a parieto-mastoid suture. Okay, from outside I have shown you that this is the lower end of the parietal bone, postero-inferior end of the parietal bone, and this is the, so this is the parieto-mastoid suture, and this suture here, it lies here, but it is not clear. Okay, in this skull it is not very clear, probably from very old age, so the suture have started fusing. Then there is a occipito-mastoid, okay, between the occipital bone and the mastoid bone. Here that suture from external surface, occipito-mastoid, and this suture is seen here. See this, if you can see this suture. Let me bring it close. This suture here, see, this is the occipito-mastoid suture is also seen from inside, okay, and the petrooccipital suture, a suture here is seen, which is very well seen. This suture between the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone here and that of the basilar part of the occipital bone. This is called as the petrooccipital suture, and in this petrooccipital suture, as we will learn, will lie the inferior petrous or petrosal sinus, inferior petrosal sinus. Right, so these are the bones forming the posterior fossa, okay, and the sutures and fissure which are there. An important fissure here which is seen is the jugular foramina, irregular fissure, but it is called as jugular foramina, and in the center it is the foramina magnum is there. Let us come to the boundaries of the posterior cranial fossa. The boundaries of the posterior cranial fossa, anteriorly it is bounded by the, and separating the posterior cranial fossa to the middle cranial fossa. So what was the posterior boundary of the middle cranial fossa? It is now the anterior boundary of the posterior cranial fossa. Now it was the dorsum sali, this bone, okay, this square shaped bone, okay, hanging, I mean say just projecting plate of the bone which is at the ends will have the posterior clinoid process, okay. So it is called as the dorsum sali, and posterior clinoid process are seen here at the end. On this side it is broken, okay, on this side it is, but here you can see this is the posterior clinoid process, that projection is small projection. So then after this dorsum sali and posterior clinoid process, the superior border of petrous temporal bone. So if we start tracing from here, that is the dorsum sali, posterior clinoid process, then come on to the superior border of the petrous temporal bone, okay, and then on the lateral side it is bounded by the mastoid part of the temporal bone. As I said, this mastoid part of the temporal bone, this part. So on lateral side it is that mastoid part of the temporal bone is here, and then it will be if you still go backward, okay, this is the after mastoid, the postero-inferior angle of the parietal bone. Let me just tilt it so that you can see. So after the superior border of the petrous temporal bone here, This was the mastoid bone, okay. This was the mastoid part of temporal bone, and now this is the postero-inferior angle of parietal bone. This was the parietal bone. On this side I will show you a bigger parietal bone is there. This is the postero-inferior angle of parietal bone. So it will be the mastoid and then posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone. So this will be on the lateral side, okay. They will form the lateral boundary. So we have learned the anterior boundary, and then this is the lateral boundary is there, okay. Posteriorly it is bounded by the squamous part of the occipital bone. So right from here up to this place, the whole thing posteriorly this whole thing, it is bounded by the squamous part. As you can see from outside, the whole bone is the single bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone. So it is a squamous part of the temper. So these are the boundaries of the posterior cranial fossa, okay, posterior cranial fossa. Let us come to the floor, okay. So we have learned the bones which are taking part in its formation, suture and fissures which are present, and we have learned the boundary of the posterior, anterior, lateral and posterior boundary of the posterior cranial fossa. Now come to the floor. Let us see what are the structure present in the median part from anterior to posterior side. Now there is a sloping bone in the anterior part of the median cranial fossa. This sloping part, okay, this sloping, and this sloping part is called as clivus. So this is clivus, okay. This part is the clivus from dorsum sali till the margin of the foramina magnum. That is called as clivus, okay. Now this clivus, which is here, that is, it is the then comes the foramina magnum. After clivus, this will be the foramina magnum, and I told you clivus is from the dorsum sali here right up to the anterior margin of foramina, that sloping bone, and then comes the foramina magnum. And after the foramina magnum, in the midline you can see a bony ridge, okay. This is the internal occipital crest. Just note down, this bony ridge is called as internal occipital crest, and this is going right up to a bulging here, and this bulging is called as internal occipital protuberance. So this is that internal occipital protuberance after the on the upper end of the internal occipital crest. Now this internal occipital crest on the external surface will correspond to this projection here. What was that projection? This projection was external occipital protuberance, and this ridge was there, the external occipital crest. So similarly inside it is the internal occipital crest and the internal occipital protuberance, okay. Now if you see the clivus again, clivus is a sloping surface, as I said, and it is formed by the fusion of the two bones. It is fusion of the body of the sphenoid, okay, above, and the basilar part of the occipital bone below, and that's why it is called as sometime basi-sphenoid, because above it is sphenoid and below up to foramina magnum it is the basilar part of the occipital bone, hence called as sometime the clivus is called as basi-sphenoid. In this skull, as I said, that most of the fissures and sulcus are not that well seen, sutures are not well seen, because this is from quite an old age. And here also the basi-sphenoid suture, which is present otherwise between the body of the sphenoid and the basilar part of the occipital bone at the clivus, is no more here, because it closes at the age of 25 years. So after 25 years of age, you will not see the fusion, the suture between the basilar part and the body of the sphenoid, okay, the basi-sphenoid suture. So this, let us come to the petrooccipital fissure. We will come to the after this petrooccipital on either side of this clivus. Okay, see this clivus, and on either side of the clivus you can see that there is a presence of a fissure. Okay, and this fissure is called as petrooccipital fissure. Because why it is petro? Because it is between the petrous temporal bone here, posterior, this is petrous temporal bone, its posterior surface between the petrous temporal bone and the occipital bone, basal part of the occipital bone. And this suture, this fissure, which is called as petrooccipital fissure, it's better seen on this side. Petrooccipital fissure is better seen on this side. It is occupied by the inferior petrosal sinus. When we were learning this middle cranial fossa, I told you that the superior border of the petrous temporal bone lodges the superior petrosal sinus, and here it is the inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, it is inferior. Now the basilar part of the clivus gives attachment to many structures which are coming through foramina magnum upwards. Okay, for example, it gives to the membrana tectoria, to the upper band of cruciate ligament. So membrana tectoria, upper band of the cruciate ligament, and the apical ligament of the dens. Okay, these three important ligaments, they are attached onto the posterior surface, or means say onto the clivus. Okay, onto the basilar part of the clivus. Now, after this clivus, let us come to the foramina magnum, which is a large oval foramina exactly in the median plane of the posterior cranial fossa. The largest foramina in the body is the foramina. That's why it is called as foramina magnum. Now, if you will see its lateral side or borders of the foramina magnum, you can see after tilting that there is a foramina seen, where I am putting the tip of the pencil. Okay, this, and on this side also, if I put it, yes, it is better seen. This is just above the lateral margin of the foramina magnum on the inner aspect. Okay, these are the two important opening of a canal. Okay, this is called as hypoglossal canal. That means the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, will pass through canal to come out. Okay, to come out just in front of the occipital condyles. I will show you here. Here you can see this. This is the opening of the hypoglossal canal on the base of the skull, on the base of the. So this is about the foramina magnum. I am not going to tell you the various structures which are passing through the foramina magnum, because in next video I am going to cover the structures which are passing through the various fissures and foraminas at the base of the skull. Okay, and through the norma basalis interna. So I am not covering. Just remember, this is foramina magnum. Now, if you see the posterior margin of foramina magnum, then as I told, there is an internal occipital crest is running, which I have already described, and this gives attachment to a fold of dura mater called as falx cerebri. Okay, it is not cerebri, it is the falx cerebelli, because it is between the two lobes of the cerebellum. So it is called as falx cerebelli, between two lobes of cerebellum. They are attached. And then we come to the internal occipital protuberance, which I have already described. But if you will see this internal occipital protuberance here, you will see that it is related to the transverse sulci. Okay, the transverse sulcus is a transversely arranged groove here. Okay, not very well marked, only in this part it is well marked, and this is the transverse sulcus. Okay, and this is of the right side, and this is the transverse sulcus of the left side. Now the transverse sulcus of the right side is well developed, while the transverse sulcus of the left side is not so well developed. Okay, it is not so. The reason I will tell you, because the right transverse sulcus, okay, will lodges the right transverse sinus, which is a continuation of the superior sagittal sinus, okay, superior. While this inferior is not the direct continuation of this. And here comes a vein, cerebellar vein, say straight sinus, occipital sinus, right and left transverse sinus, and here above this comes the superior sagittal sinus. So many sinuses, they come in close relation of the internal occipital protuberance. So this area of the internal occipital protuberance is also known as where the confluences of sinuses takes place. Okay, various confluences of sinuses, dural venous sinuses, they come and join each other. Okay, at this place, okay, just in front of this internal occipital protuberance. Now this we have completed from clivus, foramina magnum, occipital crest, protuberance, the median area. Okay, that area we have already completed. Okay, petrooccipital fissure also we have covered. Now come to the lateral side of this posterior cranial fossa, the lateral area of the posterior cranial fossa. Now there is an internal acoustic meatus which is present on the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, where I am putting the tip of pencil. This is internal acoustic, and this is the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. On this side you can also see the posterior surface of petrous, and this is that internal acoustic meatus is there. Now this internal acoustic meatus, it transmits the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve and the labyrinthine vessels, which takes origin from pontine artery. Labyrinthine artery takes origin from the basilar artery. Okay, so this 7th and 8th cranial nerve, they go inside it, okay, and along with the vessel. Now let us see the right and left transverse sulci. I have already shown you the right and the left transverse sulci, in which I have told you that there runs this sulci, they run from the internal occipital protuberance, okay, and it lodges the right transverse sinus and the left transverse sinus, okay, transverse sinus. When you will trace this right or the left transverse sinus, you will see that then it just becomes a dilated or the very broad structure here, especially on right side, and this begins at the mastoid angle of the parietal bone. This is the parietal bone, and here it comes at the mastoid. So at and postero-inferior angle, or where it is forming the parieto-mastoid suture, at this point here it begins as a sigmoid sinus, or you can say that the sigmoid sinus begins, okay, as a direct continuation of the transverse sinus on right side as well as transverse sinus on left side. You can yourself see that right sigmoid sinus, which is an A-shaped curved structure here, is quite deep here or bigger as compared to the left sigmoid sinus, as compared to that of the left sigmoid sinus. Now this sigmoid sinus will continue as a transverse sinuses, and as it is a curved structure, S-shaped structure, okay, it passes at the posterior end of the jugular foramina. See this sigmoid sinus. Let us see. This sigmoid sinus ends here into a dilated space which is nothing but here it is called as jugular foramina. Okay, just below the internal acoustic meatus, it is jugular foramina is here. Okay, so it ends into the jugular foramina. The blood goes through the jugular foramina from the sigmoid sinus, and just below the jugular foramina outside it there is a presence of the jugular bulb which continues as the internal jugular vein. So sigmoid sinus ultimately pour its blood outside into the internal jugular vein. Okay, now let us come to this jugular foramina. Now this jugular foramina is a Sorry, excuse me please. It is situated at the posterior end of the petrooccipital fissure. I told you that in the beginning. This fissure between the basisphenoid bone and the petrous temporal bone is the petrooccipital fissure. This is the petrooccipital fissure. And if you trace this petrooccipital fissure, it will continue into this irregular wide space, and this is called as jugular foramina. This is called as jugular, and this is bounded by the petrous temporal bone above. It is bounded by the petrous temporal bone above, and below by the jugular process of the occipital bone. Okay, this is the jugular process of the occipital bone. Anyway, this is a wide foramina, and it is usually divided into three parts: anterior, middle, and posterior part. From the posterior part, the sigmoid sinus becomes continuous as an internal jugular vein. In the middle part of this gives passage to the three cranial nerves, that is 9th, 10th and 11th, glossopharyngeal, vagus and accessory, that passes from the intermediate part of this. While these nerves are coming towards the jugular foramina, they lie here on the jugular process. Okay, in this is called as jugular process on this bone, okay, of the occipital. Okay, they lie here in relation to this, and from the anterior most part of this, the foramina, jugular foramina, passes a small sinus which we have learned as the inferior petrosal sinus. It runs here is the inferior. I told you that from superior border of the petrous temporal bone, it is the superior petrosal sinus, and from this it is the inferior petrosal sinus, which are the backward continuation of the this coronal, the sinus that is called as the cavernous sinus, okay, which lie on either side of the body of the sphenoid in the middle cranial fossa. I hope that you have understood the posterior cranial fossa. I have covered into the many headings to make it easy. Now the margin of this transverse sinus as well as the superior border of the petrous temporal bone, they give attachment to a horizontal fold of dura mater which separate it from the the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere with the cerebellum. Okay, so that fold of the dura mater which is horizontal is called as tentorium cerebelli, because it is like a tent, hence it is called as, and just below the fold of dura mater horizontal lies the hind brain, that is cerebellum, pons and medulla. Pons and medulla, they are in relation to this clivus sloping part, and the posterior part and lateral part is in relation to the cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, right and left cerebellar, and through foramina magnum will pass the medulla. Okay, it will pass the medulla, right? So this is about the posterior cranial fossa. Thank you very much for watching this video.